Good evening. I'm Reverend Mark Blue, the president of the Buffalo NAACP branch, and I would like to welcome you to our virtual roundtable discussion on fighting for your vote, sponsored by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Women League of Voters of Buffalo and Niagara, and Self-Advocacy of New York State. We have our moderator who is going to be conducting for this evening. She is Buffalo's first awardee 2020 Women of Influence, Buffalo City Court Judge Lenore Foot Beavers.
All right.
Good evening, everyone. As Reverend Blue stated, today's program is entitled Fight for Our Vote, a collaboration and discussion sponsored by 3 organizations that serve different populations and communities, but share a common goal of facilitating and protecting the right to vote for all Americans. Those Americans who have been historically disenfranchised and sometimes even blocked from voting based on race, disability, and gender. The organizations represented today are the NAACP, whose mission is to secure the political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights in order to eliminate race-based discrimination and also to ensure the health and well-being of all persons. The League of Women Voters, an organization that was established to educate women for citizenship and later widened its scope to ensure all citizens understand the public issues of the day. And Self-Advocacy of New York State, a group that promotes self-advocacy for people with developmental disabilities. The message today is simple. We want everyone to understand and believe that every vote counts. And voting is essential because it is our platform to ensure our representatives hear our voices and opinions. There are several examples of close elections that reinforce the message that every vote counts. For example, we saw this play out locally back in 2015 when the Grand Island Town Supervisor's race was decided by just 14 votes. Even more incredible is that there were 12,500 eligible voters for that election, but only 5,500 people actually voted. Litigation is still pending regarding the 2020 congressional race in Central New York, but so far, that lead in that race is 12 votes. Also in 2020, 42 congressional races were decided by less than a 5% margin. Many believe these close races are heavily influenced by the changing demographic of voters. In 2020, the rising American electorate includes 150 million people of color, unmarried women, and young people. This constitutes about 64% of the electorate. The Fair Fight campaign led by Stacey Abrams states it best. Voting is the bedrock on which our community's future and your ambitions are built. I now would like to introduce our panelists. I will begin with Jennifer Wilson. Ms. Wilson is the Deputy Director for the League of Women Voters of New York State. She serves as their in-house lobbyist, policy advisor, and communications representative. Since joining the League in 2015, she's helped advocate for the passage of progressive voting reforms, including early voting, primary consolidation, pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, and voter registration modernization. Ms. Wilson will give a brief presentation on the women's suffrage and how the League of Women Voters became an outgrowth of the suffrage movement, as well as the racial divides in America. Ms. Wilson?
Favors. So I'm not a historian, if you couldn't tell by my intro, but I am someone who's very interested in history. And through my work with the League, I've had the opportunity to participate in a lot of suffrage lectures and a lot of celebrations around suffrage in New York State. So I just put together a brief PowerPoint presentation talking about suffrage specifically in New York State, but really more focusing on the divide in women's suffrage between the abolition movement and the suffrage movement and the impact that's had as we've moved forward into more modern times with relation to voting rights. So as a quick refresher for everyone, since I'm sure most of you haven't heard about this since you were in grade school. New York State was a hotbed for women's suffrage, particularly in Seneca Falls. And the Seneca Falls Convention was one of the most pivotal moments in the women's suffrage movement, which took place at the Wesleyan Chapel. And this convention had over 300 attendees, both men and women. And this is where thought leaders of the time came together to talk about suffrage and to put forward what they called the Declaration of Sentiments, which was essentially this document talking about rights for all, and particularly voting rights for all, and the importance that that had at the time for so many marginalized communities that were being overlooked. And these are just some of the things that were included in there and that spoke about really the importance of why they needed the vote at that time. And originally, the abolition movement and the suffrage movement were really closely tied together. Frederick Douglass, pictured here, of course, was one of the most important thought leaders at that time. And even though he wasn't from New York State originally, he was very active in the Northeast, in New York, Massachusetts, also in Maryland. And he worked really closely with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who are two very, very pivotal New York State women's suffrage leaders, often thought of as the godmothers of women's suffrage. And during the Civil War, initially, the women's suffrage movement and the abolition movement were really, really close together, really tied closely together. But as the war went on, they actually separated, and there became this division of the former enslaved people and people who were currently enslaved fighting in this war, and the white women at the time who felt that there was this division between trying to figure out who should get the vote first. And at the time, the abolitionist movement said that they should have the vote first because this was such a pivotal time in their political history, whereas the women who were also helping in the war effort, whether it was helping to help wounded soldiers or helping with other things that women were allowed to do at the time, felt that they should either have the vote in tandem or they should have the vote first. And there became this really big divide within the movement. And Frederick Douglass was someone who tried to reason with the suffrage leaders at that time and tried to say, it really is much more important for us to have the vote at this time. We're being killed, we're being lynched, our families are being torn apart, our children are being murdered. We need to have the vote now. This is our time to get it. Women will get it later. And ultimately, what happened is the movement split, and it became two separate women's suffrage movements: the National Suffrage Party, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and the National Women's Suffrage Association, which was led by Lucy Burns and Alice Paul. And Lucy Burns was from Brooklyn, interestingly, and Alice Paul was a Quaker from New Jersey. The 15th Amendment passed in 1870, and of course, this was one of the most important movements at the time, giving voting rights to all people, all men, regardless of race or color or previous condition of servitude. But of course, we know that that wasn't really the case, that yes, that amendment was added, but there were so many barriers in the way of Black men actually having access to the vote, whether it was poll taxes or grandfather clauses, literacy tests, or straight out violence. They still did not have access to the vote. And unfortunately, we hate to say it, but we have to acknowledge it, suffragists took advantage of this animosity that Southern legislators felt towards Black men at that time, and basically weaponized this to say, hey, we see that you guys are really not liking that Black men now are enfranchised. Why don't you give us the vote, because we have similar values to white men, and therefore we are on your side in this movement. It's terrible that that happened, but it did happen, and it needs to be acknowledged. Of course, at the time, African-American women weren't sitting on the sidelines. They weren't just watching this all go down. They had their own powerful movement that was happening internally. They formed their own political clubs. Some of these even still exist today. And they spoke at different churches. They organized their own rallies and protests. They had lectures. They were extremely active in the movement. And here I've just listed some of the most pivotal African-American women leaders at the time, just to sort of pay homage and to recognize them. And we are splitting these presentations in two, so I believe this is my stopping point to pass it over, but when we come back to me, we'll bring us up to the actual 19th Amendment.
Thank you so much. We will next hear from L. Nathan Hare. Mr. Hare, a lifelong Buffalo resident, has been a leader in youth services for over 45 years. His distinguished career includes serving as the director of the ECC Office of Special Programs, Commissioner of Erie County Youth Services, Western Region Director of the Berkshire Farm Center and Services for Youth, and the President and CEO of the Community Action Organization of Erie County for over 18 years. Mr. Hare will present on the historical challenges of voter suppression in America. Mr. Hare?
Outstanding. Can you guys hear me? Okay, it looks like I'm good. So the Constitution guarantees many rights, including the right to free speech and freedom of religion. But neither when passed in 1788 or as the Constitution exists today with its 27 amendments, does the Constitution actually contain an express right to vote. The Constitution does refer to the vote or voting at least 40 times. Voting rights have been established over time by the 15th Amendment that forbids the denying the right to vote on the basis of race or color. The 19th Amendment forbid denying the vote on the basis of gender, or at least on the basis of sex. The 19th Amendment, that was the 19th Amendment on the basis of sex. The failure to pay a payroll tax or some other kind of obstructive feature was prohibited by the 24th Amendment, and getting young people to be able to vote at the age of 18 was provided by the 26th Amendment. So today the right to vote exists, but what is really established in the right to vote is the availability of that right without discrimination. And that's really what we want to focus on in this discussion today. It seems as if the founding fathers forgot about establishing the vote as a fundamental right. Article 1, Section 4 states that the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature of that state. In other words, the founding fathers deliberately decided to leave the states with the power to establish when, how, and where voting could take place, essentially making voting initially to be a state right, not a federal right. This gave the states the power to decide who could and who could not vote, and to disabuse Africans and other people of colors, women, those without property, people that are disabled and couldn't get to the polling place, to be able to deny all of those people on that basis the right to vote. The federal right to vote is inferred in Article 4 of the Constitution, which says that the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government. Since citizens ultimately or hold ultimate power in a republic, if a state denied all of its citizens the right to vote, that would be a denial of a republican form of government. If such a denial occurred, then the guarantee clause would open the door for federal intervention. And that's how the federal government became so involved in ensuring that people did have the right to vote. But that's taken a long time and a lot of abrasion between those that were for federalism versus those that were for states' rights. And so the right to vote is inferred by the Constitution, but the right of the individual states to decide who could vote was also referred or inferred in Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution. That gave the states the right to discriminate, first in terms of who could vote, i.e. to property owning white males or owners of some level of livestock. While the 15th Amendment stated that you could not deny the right to vote on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, under Jim Crow laws and the Black codes, you could deny the right to vote on the basis of your ability to guess how many jelly beans there were in a jar, or array of any other kinds of things like, reciting the Constitution backwards. The 19th Amendment guaranteed women the right to vote, but African men and women needed the Voting Rights Act in addition to the 15th Amendment to be able to obtain the same rights as the 19th Amendment gave to white women. Even that legislation has been stripped of its real enforcement power in subsequent Supreme Court decisions. Every year, new tactics are undertaken and accepted by voting majorities to marginalize particular people's rights, such as overly stringent voter ID laws, requiring registration far in advance of an election, limited or non-existent absentee voting, difficult procedures for obtaining required voter IDs, and purging registered voter lists shortly before an election. Common sense should tell us that people would not persist in this continuing effort to vote, including gerrymandering election results or election districts, unless there was something of extremely high value in the exercise of people's right to vote. We have to take advantage while we can. That's my end for this section.
Thank you so much. Our next panelist is BJ Stasio. Mr. Stasio is the president of the board of directors of the Self-Advocacy Association of New York State. He has been employed by the Office of People with Developmental Disabilities for over 20 years. He has a nonprofit organization, Buffalo Racing, focused on getting people with disabilities involved in 5K races. Mr. Stasio will present on voting accessibility issues as it relates to people with disabilities, as well as the perception of the community of people with disabilities. Mr. Stasio?
Thank you very much, Judge Beavers. And Nathan is, of course, a tough act to follow, but I'm going to give it a try. I see, now today reminds me of, I see a lot of my friends on here, and we very often have discussions about how important our vote is. And I want to remind everyone that some of the elections we're going to talk about have won by, people have won by 13 votes, 1 vote. Your vote matters, and if you're worried about your vote and you wonder if it counts, it's your right as a U.S. citizen to vote. Just because you have a disability, don't think your vote doesn't matter, because no matter who our elected officials are, whether we voted for them or not, they work for us as U.S. citizens. So please vote, and if you're voting the way your parents vote, for example, because I've heard some of that, it's not really your vote, it's your, for example, your parents' extra vote. So exercise your advocacy skills and please vote. And accessibility is so important. Like when I go to vote, I always make sure the accessible voting machine is working, and that if it's not, I tell people, don't be afraid to tell them it's not working, because it's your right to use that. And if it's not, you have a right to make them make it work, because it's your access to your vote, because you want your vote to be private and yours alone. I remember when I first voted when I was 21, I was so proud of that right to vote. That was my first, as I consider it, my real advocacy, and I was so proud of that. I didn't share my vote with anybody because it was mine and mine alone, and my person didn't win, but I was so proud that I exercised my right. And that's what being an advocate is all about, exercising your right. And all the panelists are advocates here, like me, for you, for us as U.S. citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now have a couple of questions for the panel members. I would like to remind everyone that you are able to put your questions in the Q&A box at any point, and someone will be monitoring those questions. And we do have a slide that can be put up just to kind of show you where that Q&A box is at the bottom of your screen and how you actually can access the closed captioning as well. And as you see there, it's right at the bottom with the Q&A section next to the raise your hand option. And then you can also access the closed captioning as well. And you can just click live transcript at the bottom there if you need that accessibility. So my first question for Ms. Wilson, you mentioned during your presentation that African-American suffragists created their own clubs and fraternal orders and used churches to further their advocacy efforts. Can you compare this to the present day initiatives like the Black Lives Matter movement and other groups that have used some of the same tactics?
Yeah, I definitely think we still see these similar organizations happening. Like I said, a lot of them still exist today. I mean, the NAACP came about around that time as well. So I think we still see those similar methods being used to advance advocacy. And it's kind of exciting now because, of course, we are in a more digital world. So we get to see that play out online as well. And the way that organizations that are 100+ years old have advanced to use technology to their advantage and to engage younger people in this movement is really incredible.
It is incredible, and it's so exciting to see everyone so engaged and so involved. And Mr. Hare, just to pick up on what you were talking about, to expand your remarks regarding the US Constitution and the rights of individuals with respect to voting, can you touch on a little bit the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act and what that means, and how the US Supreme Court decision in Shelby v. Attorney General Holder impacts voter suppression tactics taken by state legislatures?
You know, it's interesting because it was reported that John Roberts, who is now our Chief Supreme Court Justice, actually wanted to get on the Supreme Court for the singular purpose of eviscerating the Voter Rights Act. His position was, well, we've gotten better. We're not as terrible on discrimination as we were before, so we should drop, that provision of the Voter Rights Act. But as soon as they dropped that provision of enforcement, then the people who had been waiting in the woods for an opportunity to go back to discriminating the way that they had been doing before, they just came up with exotic ways to discriminate again. And that's what was done. And our problem is that if you don't persist in voting for the people that believe in the principles that you say you believe in, if you don't fight for that at the ballot box, not by fighting in the street, you have to fight at the ballot box, because that's the only place where the fight actually sticks, where the decisions get made and they stick. And so if you don't do that, then people will gerrymander voting districts. You'll have 100 Black people living in one district and then 100 other people, white people, living in 16 other districts around the state, and they'll win those districts, and you'll win the one district that you're still in because they carved you out, and that's what gerrymandering is all about. So we have to continue to persist and fight to get people in office who believe in the principles that we say we believe in, and we have to keep after it over and over and over again. We may not be able to win in the census count and how they divide up who's in what districts right now, because you have to live with the legislators in those states that exist right now. But if you persist in voting over the next 10 years, you can elect different legislators so that when we do the census 10 years from now, you'll be in a position to affect how that census gets done. And this gerrymandering of congressional districts and other districts, for council districts and so on, you'll be able to reverse a lot of that. But this is really the fight of our day. If we really want to see all of us get shepherded into full citizenship in this country, we have to win this fight, and we got to win it in the long term, not in the short term.
Absolutely. And there's about 9 states that were previously under the watch of the Voting Rights Act and now are not. So I guess we'll have to keep our eye on those 9 states.
Judge, can I just want to say one more thing on that point? The other thing that I want to put on that point is that we should get that provision established for all of the states, not just for some of the states, because the Black codes did not arise in Georgia. The Black codes arose in Illinois, in the North. And so we need to understand that there has been this marginalization of populations using the power of the majority for the history of this country. And we can't fight that battle by just picking on just the southern states that seceded, because the behaviors in the southern states, the attitudes that those behaviors were based on, existed in Western states, in Midwestern states, and in Northern states.
Absolutely. And to get more involved with contacting your legislature on those issues, you should contact one of these agencies to help you get your information and guidance.
Absolutely.
Mr. Stasio, I'm going to turn back to you. I recently read a report issued by the American Bar Association that indicated that 1 in 6 eligible voters in the 2016 election were people with disabilities. And you have stated these individuals are less likely to vote for various reasons. What are some of the key issues voters with disabilities need to have addressed by their representatives that those issues should be in the forefront of campaign discussions?
Well, of course, it's jobs, equitable jobs for people with disabilities, because if you can do the job, you should get paid the equitable wage that you deserve. And of course, with all the Medicaid talk going on, the Medicaid cuts, Medicaid is a concern for people with disabilities because that's what drives the services that we receive to help us be productive members of society and also voting members of society. So the Medicaid is really important, and just an understanding that people with disabilities are important to society. We have a lot to offer. That's some of those things we tell the politicians when we talk to them. We're not only people, but we're people who could vote for you or could not vote for you. So remember that when you talk to us, don't dismiss what we say, because what we all say has value, because we could either vote you in office or vote you out of office.
Exactly. And maybe quickly, because we do have a question in the Q&A that kind of is really relevant to what we're talking about right now. A point by Janet, who said that she's experienced those in their 20s and 30s that are less inclined to vote because they don't think their vote counts, particularly in non-presidential election years. So any advice to what she could tell people to encourage them to vote, even when it's even just local races? Every year, the races are important. Any panel member like to take that?
I'll take that, Judge Beavers.
Okay.
For Janet, I understand that point, because I didn't understand till I got to vote that, say, the district attorney who makes the laws or who enforces the laws for our area works for us to protect us as citizens of the county we live in. So that election is important because he's kind of the gatekeeper of the laws to protect us all and keep us safe. So if we don't like his politics, of course, we don't vote for him. And even the school board budgets for kids going to school are important, because if they don't go to school, they're not well educated and they won't be able to vote when they're ready to vote because of the lack of education that they have. So all that is important, of course.
Great points. Anyone else like to comment on that question? All right, Ms. Wilson will now continue with her presentation with Women Gaining the Right to Vote and how the League of Women Voters was established.
Great, thank you. Okay. Let's skip ahead the easy way. So looking ahead with all of this, so all of the great work done by the women's suffrage movement led us to women slowly, state by state, winning the right to vote. And I included this little factoid here, even though it's not New York State related, that Wyoming was one of the first states to grant women the right to vote. And it's interesting to think about, because at that time, out west was very rural. It was totally undeveloped, but at least by the American settlers there. Obviously, there was native tribes living there. But in Wyoming in particular, these women were doing backbreaking work. They were building houses, they were cutting down trees, and the men finally realized, oh my gosh, they're equal to us. We need to have this voting power. So slowly over time, state by state, different states started to enfranchise women voters. And New York State had a suffrage amendment that was put forward in 1915 that ultimately failed. And then in 1970 was finally passed and signed into law in November of 1917. So the 19th Amendment was then passed in 1920 to enfranchise the entire country, all women in the country, to have the right to vote. And as Nathan pointed out earlier, that's not necessarily true, kind of in the same case of the 15th Amendment. Yes, it was written down and we have it in the document, it's printed out and everything, but that didn't guarantee the right to vote for people of color at that time. And the same exact barriers that were presented to Black men through the 15th Amendment were presented to Black women with the 19th Amendment. And it really wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that we actually started to see some of these barriers start to break down. But as we'll talk about in a second, those barriers, they aren't totally down. Those barriers are still there in many, many states. And unfortunately, New York State is one of them. So the League, we came shortly after the 19th Amendment. Actually, the New York City League was shortly before the 19th Amendment in 1919, which is a very easy way for us to remember that in 1919, the New York City League was formed before the 19th Amendment. And we were directly from the Women's Suffrage Party. So it was essentially just a name change, and Carrie Chapman Catt was our national founder, which happened a year later in 1920. So we just celebrated our 100th anniversary. And the League was really formed, kind of to BJ's point, instead of relying on their parents to figure out how they wanted to vote, we wanted to empower women to not rely on their husbands to decide how they were going to vote in elections. In the beginning, we also helped women run for office, and we don't do that anymore, but we still are very, very involved in voter registration and nonpartisan voter education on candidates, on different ballot referendums, and just on elections in general, especially local elections, where a lot of the time there isn't a lot of information available on who's running locally and why you should care about local elections. So looking towards today, this monument actually was resurrected in Central Park during COVID in the summer. So that is Sojourner Truth and Susan B. Anthony and Carrie Chapman Catt all sitting around and kind of having a conversation. So you can, next time you get to go on a trip to New York City, you can go check that out. It's in Central Park. But New York State has been one of the worst states in the nation in terms of voter turnout. And this was mentioned before that, I mentioned that the South is where we kind of think of having these really oppressive voting laws, but actually the Northeast has been historically an area of the country where there wasn't early voting. There was really archaic absentee voting laws. There was really hard deadlines on registering to vote. And it's only now that these states are finally waking up and saying, oh my gosh, it's not the 1700s anymore. Maybe people should be able to vote early. Maybe we can let them sign in on electronic poll books. Maybe we can change the deadline to register so that they don't need to do it to change their party a year in advance. So since 2017, we've had a lot of voting improvements in New York State, but there's a long way to go still. And we saw in the 2020 election a lot of the flaws in our voting systems in New York State, and we're continuing to work on those. And I think Nathan is actually going to cover some of the other really big outstanding issues in New York State. So I won't dwell on that, but I do have one more thing, which is the League has been working with the Developmental Disabilities Planning Council on doing some work specifically for voters with disabilities and working with Disability Rights New York. And I saw some Disability Rights New York people are on this webinar, so shout out to them. We did some really great webinars during COVID, some remote trainings on how people with disabilities could vote during COVID, all different kinds of safety precautions, some of the new laws that passed. And this organization, Developmental Disabilities Planning Council, has asked us to collect information anytime we do any training or public outreach to the disability community. So I'm going to put a link in the chat to a survey. And if you want to fill it out at the end of this, that would be really great. It helps us, it helps them. And I would very much appreciate it, but no pressure. And with that, I am going to hand it back.
All right, thank you. And just to kind of pick up on what Ms. Wilson was talking about with respect to legislation, I want to turn our attention to recent legislation attempting to modernize our voting laws. In New York, laws were passed in 2019, as she stated, to finally allow for early voting, synchronizing our federal and state primary elections, pre-registration for teens, and other provisions to bring our voter laws into the 21st century. In addition, states like Oregon, their legislature is considering a bill that would allow people convicted of a felony to vote while they are still in prison. There are well over 400 bills pending in 35 states that propose to increase access and voting options for those who want to vote. However, since December of 2020, there have been over 100 bills introduced in 28 state legislatures that many perceive to be an attempt to suppress voter participation, particularly in communities of color and historically marginalized people. Many of the pending bills propose to restrict the use of mail-in ballots, voter ID mandates, requiring ballots to be notarized, exact match ballot signatures, and even authorizing some state legislatures to determine the winner of a presidential election,
Mhm.
despite the final outcome of votes in that state, just to name a few. So I would ask Mr. Hare to continue his presentation with a discussion on inferior citizenship and what that means, and how marginalized groups like those with disabilities, homeless individuals, those with a criminal history, anyone whose primary language is not English, etc., how in effect they become inferior citizens that often encounter impediments to voting. If we as a society accept these impediments, are we allowing the exclusion of members of our population from fully participating in politics and essentially experiencing systematic disenfranchisement? So if you could just talk about the inferior citizenship and the systematic disenfranchisement of people, that would be wonderful.
That is so great. I really appreciate it, Judge Beavers. You really nailed it in terms of, we need to understand that these are not decisions that were made in a vacuum where somebody just came together on one day and said, let's just do this terrible thing, this way. This situation that we live in now is based on a belief system that existed inside of people for a very long period of time, for centuries. We have people who were looked at as being different than other people who were looked at as even being competitors for power with other people. They use differences as a way to limit people's power to be able to affect how life and privilege and opportunity is provided in the United States. I took this lead from an article written by Cassandra Porter called Back to the Future, Our Enduring Legacy of Racism. An example of the day-to-day experiences of inferior citizenships, little things involving, for one, a young African-American girl remembering the first time that she had been called the N-word. She was in the 3rd grade on a kickball court in Bellevue, Nebraska. The team she was on won. As she walked in the lines to exchange congratulatory handshakes, a classmate screamed the racist epithet at her when it was her team's turn to shake hands. As she was the only African American in her classmate wanted to humiliate her and put her in her place. Now, maybe this classmate was hoping that the young 3rd grader would be afraid to play in the next kickball game and successfully restrict her participation on an elementary school playground. But the young 3rd grader continued to play kickball, but she was wary of this classmate for the rest of the year. She had to live with this wariness of this classmate and other classmates like this girl for the rest of the year. This is what inferior citizenship looks like. Other examples are like a Florida woman's recent rants about an Asian American nail salon owner is caught on video. A customer at a Texas Jack in the Box tells a worker to go back to Mexico. I love that. You're born in the United States, you're a 3rd generation Mexican, and somebody tells you got to go back to Mexico. In Connecticut, an African-American Yale University student was detained by campus police after a white student called the police while she slept in a study area. In Colorado, a white woman called police on 2 Native Americans who were on the same campus tour. They were registered for the tour, walking with the tour, and this woman called the police on them as if they were doing something wrong by participating in a tour that they were registered to participate in. Societal acceptance of the idea of inferior citizenship results in group-wide acceptance of the denial of particular groups' humanity. Having denied a group's humanity, it is easy to deny such persons right to full citizenship. After centuries of having literally lived off the blood, sweat, and lives of Black people and people of color, or having accepted this fate being imposed upon Black people or people of color, the internalized view of the equality of Black and brown people did not arrive with the message of the 13th and the 15th Amendments. It had become the habit of most Caucasian Americans to deny or accept the denial of full citizenship to people of color. This inbred internalization of inferior citizenship didn't stop with Black and brown people. It meant the marginalization of women, of people without property, of people with different sets of abilities, people with different kinds of disabilities, even people with different gender identities were marginalized out of this habit of seeing one set of people as being normal and being the possessors, the rightful possessors of power, and everybody else either getting a little bit or getting none. Inferior citizenship meant unequal protection under the laws of the United States, unequal distribution of or access to resources, failing even to have your needs considered among the competing priorities pursued by the society as a whole. The acceptance of by some of the very idea of inferior citizenship for others made the institutionalization of that inferior citizenship normal. It made the undermining and marginalization of the vote, even registering to vote, of inferior citizens accepted by broad swaths of the American people, both North and South. This unresolved, internalized acceptance of people's marginalization is at the core of the so-called divisiveness afflicting America's political landscape today. It is the corrosion eating away at America's conception of itself. If the directions in which the organized society of people called Americans is established by policies, and if policies are established by the majority will of the people, and the majority will of the people is expressed by the vote, then exercising the right and privilege to vote is the most fundamental marker of American citizenship. How America addresses it will determine the quality of America's future ahead. The right to vote was purchased by the blood of dozens of generations of Americans. Only the most foolish among us will throw this gift away. I'll pass it back to Judge Beaver. Thank you.
I don't want to leave you just yet, because we have several comments in the Q&A that people are really very concerned about the lack of a uniform approach by the states and even a federal mandate with respect to felons having the right to vote. That there needs to be a strong push for that. Do you have any final kind of thoughts that you want to state about that?
I think that that's the right attitude that we have to have. We have to go even further. We have a country in which, as you saw what happened January 6th of this year, we have a country in which there is a large portion of our population that doesn't even know what civics means. They have no idea what it means to be a citizen of the United States. They just think because they're here and because they're white, then that just somehow endows them with the power of citizenship. That's patently not true. The only way that we can survive as a community of people and not tear each other apart is by all of us buying into our citizenship. That means that all of us who know have to teach all of them that don't know. We have to get this into the schools, in preschool, in primary grades, in elementary school, through high school. People should not come out into the world to work unless they already know how to be a citizen of the United States. I think that's where the core of what we're talking about where the rubber has to meet the road.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to turn back to Mr. Stasio. I'd like him to provide suggestions for individuals with disabilities or those who want to get involved with helping those with disabilities, strategies and action that can be taken if someone believes their voting rights are being denied due to their disability.
Well, thank you, Judge Beavers. But Birdie reminded me of something I forgot to say. So if I could take a minute to do that, I want to make sure I do that because this is an important point. I need staff to drive me to the polling place to go vote and to go in and help me if I need it. That doesn't mean the staff who's assisting me should talk for me. The poll workers should know to talk to me. And if I need assistance, my staff or I will ask for that. But most likely I will ask for that. So if anybody who's with us tonight has that issue, please remember, speak up for yourself. It's your vote. Now, as far as your question, if you feel your vote is being denied you, you have a right to complain and say something because you're not a wallflower. The advocates I know in New York State are not a wallflower. So you're a role model for the next generation of advocates who come after me, come after us, and they could say, look what we did. This is how they did it. This is the roadmap of how they did it, because your vote is your right and it's your choice. So please use it wisely and tell the county that you live in the problems you're having so they can educate the people, the poll workers who assist you, that people with disabilities are just people. And it reminds me that we are all, like I have a disability, an obvious disability, but we are all temporarily able-bodied. So we all could be disabled someday. And we'll all be having this discussion if we all become disabled someday. And I don't want anybody to feel what I feel or somebody else feels, because your vote matters. Please vote and just let your voice be heard, because a silent voice is not a good voice. It's a quiet voice, and you just let people walk all over you. Like I say, you know, it's better to be visible than be invisible and be on the sidelines and cheering me or your people on to say something that you wanted to say. I don't speak for everybody, but as president of SANES, we want to hear from you if something is going on wrong, so we can help you correct it, assist you in correcting it, and give you the skills to correct it yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And you know, your voice and your vote is what makes the leaders have to pay attention.
Yes,
you
that
don't
is true.
vote, then they won't have to listen. But when you make your voice heard and you vote, then the issues that are important to you must be addressed by them. So it's really, really important for everyone, because all of us have issues that we want to make sure our leaders are addressing. So we just want to remind you that you must get registered first. If you're not registered to vote, please get registered to vote. For the primary this year, you must be registered by May 28th. If you need to change your address, make sure you do that by June 2nd. The deadline to register for the November election is October 8th. Voting by absentee ballot has a whole nother host of different deadlines. So you should go to the website for the Erie County Board of Elections, or whatever county that you may live in, and make sure that you get that information. You can also contact these 3 organizations that are sponsoring this today and get whatever help and information that you may need in order to make sure that you get registered, your family and friends are all registered, your neighbors are registered, and just whatever help that you think you might need in order to get this, this message through to our community. So I'm going to just remind everyone that you can put your questions in the Q&A box. I think we've been having some come through, and I've been trying to handle them as the topic is being discussed, but I think we have a few more and I'll be collecting those. But my final question for panelists today, before turning over to the audience questions, is about staying educated and with respect to voting rights. And I highly recommend that everyone watch the Stacey Abrams documentary, All In: The Fight for Democracy. And it's a great review of the history of voting, the current day analysis of voter suppression issues, and just knowing your rights regarding votes. So, you know, Stacey Abrams is quoted in the film stating, "If the power of the right to vote was truly made available to everyone in America, it would change the future of this nation." And so to all the panelists, I just want to know, what does that statement mean to you? And what final thoughts do you have for our audience today? I'll start with Ms. Wilson.
Great, thank you. And I hate to do this. Before we get into this, I just want to answer one question that came up before about if you're a person with disabilities, a voter with disabilities, and you feel like you're being turned away at a poll site, what can you do? During the election, the Attorney General's Office of New York State always sets up a hotline. So you can always call that hotline and report that, and they kick that over to the Board of Elections. They'll file a claim, I guess you could say, if it turns out that this is an ongoing problem, Also 866-R-VOTE, the election protection hotline, again, throughout the election is available. It's very easy to remember, 866-R-VOTE. I'll put in the chat as well. It's always circulating on social media around election time. And same thing, that is a group of lawyers and volunteers who man those phones, and advocates on the other side who, if there is some sort of issue, can directly talk to the poll site, directly talk to the County Board of Elections, and make sure that you do have access to vote. Make sure that those machines get back online and that nobody's being disenfranchised. But back to the question, in a perfect world where everyone's fully enfranchised and everyone actually has access, we have great early voting. We have tons of early voting poll sites. Everyone can get an absentee ballot who wants it. There's mail-in voting. In that perfect world, I think we would really see a more representative electoral government. And especially now that redistricting is coming, a lot of states don't have independent commissions. They've elected officials who are going to draw their own lines because the legislature likes to draw their own lines. In a representative government where everyone actually has an equal voice, maybe we'd see more independent commissions drawing those lines, and better lines that aren't gerrymandering in a way that is pushing down the voices of some groups and lifting up the voices of others. So I think that would be a nice, perfect world.
Mr. Hare.
Yes, I think it's really important what you guys are focusing on right now. If you don't participate at all, then no one takes into account anything that has anything to do with you. Think about the process. If you're running for office, the only way you can win office is to win votes. You can only win votes from people who vote. So the people that don't vote, you don't pay any attention to them at all, because it's a waste of time to pay attention to those people because you don't get any profit out of it. The only profit you get out of your advocacy with voters is if you're talking to the voters who actually vote. So it's really critical that everybody puts their 2 cents in. Do you know that it's better for you to come to the polling place on election day, get a sheet and put a blank ballot into the machine and let it count your ballot as null or void? Because the people who look at your vote don't know that you voted null or void. At least we hope, Judge Beavers, that they don't know. We hope they don't know.
They hope they don't know.
But assuming that they don't know, all they know is that you showed up. So if you see that in your area, that 90% of the African women in this area vote, that 85% of the African men vote, that 93% of the white women vote, that 98% of the handicapped and differently able people vote, then you're going to pay attention to those people's issues, because that's where the lion's share of your vote is going to come from. Even if you didn't vote for them, even if you didn't even know their names, the mere fact that you showed up, they have to take you into account. But the opposite is also true. If you don't show up, they have absolutely no reason why they should take you into account at all in any of their deliberations, in any of their considerations. This really is a fire test to our ability to be able to live together as an American community.
Great. Mr. Stasio, final thoughts?
Yes, all this reminds me of, I would like to see a person with a disability, whether it be developmental or just a disability, run for office.
Yep.
Or volunteer for the candidate of their choosing, because that's a case where you're being visible instead of invisible and
Yep.
waiting for somebody else to do it. Why wait for somebody else to do it? And it reminds me of what one of my heroes who recently passed away said, John Lewis.
Yeah.
Necessary trouble is good trouble. And
That's
sometimes
right.
to get our vote, necessary trouble is good trouble. It's
Right.
necessary if you feel your vote's not being counted. It's necessary. And don't worry about upsetting people, because you're laying the groundwork for the person after you to have their vote if you have difficulty getting your vote, just by saying something. So please say something. Don't be a mouse. Say something.
That's
And
so
remember,
true.
W.B. Du Bois told us, power yields to nothing without a demand.
Yes.
That's right.
The demand that you make is your vote. If you don't vote, you're not making a demand. You don't really have a right to complain because
Yep.
you didn't ask.
That's right. So true. And we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A about And I'll direct this to BJ. What should a voter do if a poll worker says he is disabled and cannot understand enough to vote?
Well, that's not their decision to make because they're not medical professionals and they're not you. They're there to serve you as poll workers to get your vote counted. So, that's your opportunity to educate. Whenever that happens, I'm like a tree and don't move till people listen to me because I'm very difficult to move when I get something in my head that I feel I'm being wrong, and I make sure people listen to me. And I don't care if they're mad at me after I leave. Hopefully they'll say, that guy was right. I was being not a nice person to clean it up for today's presentation.
Thank you. And I have one more question for you. Someone's asking, why should someone with a disability who needs an assistant be denied one?
They shouldn't, because the assistant works for you. That's what your Medicaid dollars or whatever you're using to get that assistant pays for. So they work for you. They're there to help you have that richer life that you're guaranteed as an American citizen. So you shouldn't be denied an assistant to help you. And if you are, that's education for your local board of elections, because they need to know that's happening so they can educate their poll workers that we with disabilities are people and we have the right to vote.
Absolutely. And don't forget that number. It's in the chat. 1-866-OUR-VOTE to report any issues that you may encounter when you are out voting. There was also a question with respect to Helen, and she said, how will ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment impact voting at the federal level? Will it negate the principle of states coordinating how elections work and who gets to vote?
I can tell you off the top that it will not change the fact that voting, the process for voting, is driven at the state level. It's a premise that was built into the Constitution by the people that created the country's format in the first place. That's what they believed in. And so if you fight the battle of trying to get that moved up to the federal level and take the states out of it, you're going to spend the next 150 years trying to win that battle. That's not going to get done. What you have to do is you got to fight the battle state by state in every state legislature. We have something like 25 or 30 state legislatures in which both the Assembly and the Senate are run by a particular party. And the governor, I think you have some situations like maybe 19 or 20, where the governor and the majority in both houses of the state legislature are of the same party. When that occurs, then that state legislature can create laws that are driven by the parties in that state's consideration, not by the consideration of the people as a whole. What I mean by that is only about 65 to 70% of the people in this country bother to identify that they're in a particular party in the first place. Right. I mean, there's a good chunk of 35% of the people in this country who they register to vote, but don't register to vote to be a part of a particular party. And so what's happening is this two-party system is fragmenting at the edges, and people are making their voices heard as independents. The problem with this independent vote is that you don't have a collective will towards a particular outcome that you're trying to get to. We have to find a way to get ourselves organized so that we operate collectively. We have to, as I indicated before, we got to fight over a 10 or 12-year period of time until you win majorities in the Senate and in the Assembly in each one of these states, so that you can break the back of those people that pass these laws that deliberately marginalize people's ability to vote, and not just marginalized by race or by ethnicity or by gender or by physical ability or mental ability, not just on those bases. People marginalized so that they can win the office. I mean, if you listen to Mitch McConnell, he's telling you, my game is to win. He don't care anything about the rest of the stuff you're talking about. He's just trying to win. And so we have to understand that there are people who just try to seize control of the electoral process in their state so that their party is the route you have to go through in order to get anything done. that means all of the money to get people elected goes to their people, et cetera, et cetera. We have to be diligent. Stacey Abrams showed us the way. She started 3 years ago, right? And she just kept swinging the bat, organizing people, getting people to come together. And she was able to get a state that hadn't voted for a Democrat in Lord knows how long. It had to be like the 1940s and 1950s, the last time they had a Democratic senator from the state of Georgia. They got two out of two they were able to get because of the work that she did. We have to take that lesson and we have to export that to every single state across the country. That's how we're going to win.
All right. And there's great information in the chat if everyone wants to kind of consult there. Helen's been putting some great information in there about the Help America Vote.
I see right there, yep.
Yes, so if you need more information, you can go to drny.org in order to learn how to do that. And I'm sure all of these organizations represented today would also assist with anything that people need. And then there's a question, what should a voter do? Oh, I'm sorry, we asked that one. Janet asked if anyone can discuss HR. They passed the House last year and pending in the Senate for Janet, maybe you can kind of elaborate exactly what your question is. What was passed in the House last year and pending in the Senate? I think there's something that you are trying to ask about. And I'm going to just kind of lead us out here. There's no more questions in the chat. I'm just going to check with Terry. Make sure I don't close out too soon.
Judge Beavers?
Yes.
There was one question in the chat or in the question and answer, which pertained to felons voting.
Okay.
And I did put an answer in there from the NAACP that Governor Cuomo on April the 18th, 2018, he signed an executive order granting those who are formerly incarcerated with felonies and even those who are on parole the right to register to vote. So let's make sure we pass that information along, because for a long while, that right has been taken away. But he did sign an executive order on April the 18th, 2018, for giving the rights back to those who are formerly incarcerated and even those who are on parole, the right to vote.
Yes. And just remember, if you have not been convicted of anything yet, you still have your right to vote. And don't let anyone tell you anything differently. There's many comments thanking the panelists for a wonderful job. You all did such a fabulous job presenting this information tonight. We hope for the audience that something was said today that will encourage you all to continue voting. And if you have not voted, we hope that this discussion has changed your perception and changed your mind about voting, and that you will get registered to vote. It's our hope that you understand that in order to change things, you must participate in the democratic process. Every single vote counts. All elections have consequences for every single person and for every family. Elections are an opportunity for change, and our democratic society depends on everyone to participate in order to hold leaders accountable, and understand that if the democratic process breaks for some, it will eventually break for all. So I just give our panel and members one last opportunity for any parting thoughts for our audience.
Well, Judge Beavers, there was a comment that someone made here regarding that they had the impression that Susan B. Anthony was sympathetic to Black women, and that they had acknowledged a close or that this was acknowledged closer after her death. And I just want people to understand, don't start judging people based on how they appeared along the pathway of getting rights assembled, for folks. I'm pretty sure that there were some Black people who said that there's some brown people, if you keep them out and give us the vote, we'll be okay with that, for this year. You know, I mean, this is the way things go. And it's because people are being marginalized that they grab on whatever vine they can grab on to try to get some traction, thinking that they can make it up, you know, the year after or the 5 years after or 10 years after. So let's not allow ourselves to get into that kind of judgment. Susie B. Anthony was a yeoman for women's rights to vote. Sojourner Truth was a yeoman for women's rights to vote, you know, and so on. Let's not get too hung up on that. Let's really focus on the fact that this country was started on the basis of marginalizing people that were not who they considered to be the us's, the people that they considered to be the normal people, the people that had a right to the privileges and opportunities that existed in this land that became the United States of America. And that premise that this country was based on is a wrong premise, period. And the only way that we're going to change the fundamentals is to get people to change their understanding of that premise. So we don't need to spend too much time judging people. We need to spend our time teaching people and motivating people and getting them to buy in that this experiment only works if we all play. And we can't all play if we're not all registered and we're not all voting and we're not all expressing ourselves and we're not all treating each other as if we are common human beings that have a right to every opportunity, every possibility that America has for all of us. I think that's where we have to go.
And there was
I'd like to say something if that's okay, Judge Beavers.
sure.
The power belongs to all of us to make change. Don't wait till the election to worry about making change. If you have a situation in your life that needs changing, the power belongs to you and it belongs to all of us as American citizens to help. And as Nathan said, I want to say this because he just inspired me to say something. Aren't we all judged enough for the color of our skin or the way we might look? We're all people. We're all trying to make this world better. So remember that.
Yep.
And I'm sorry, Ms. Wilson, before you have your final remarks, there was one more question that asked about what can you basically say to people who say, well, you have to show ID to buy cigarettes. You have to show ID to buy alcohol. So why not to vote? Do you have any response to that?
Well, I would just tell people off the top, you had to show ID in order to register to vote in the first place. So you've already done that. Having people have to run around with more ID every time they go to a primary, every time they vote in a general election is just creating extra hurdles for no reason. If your reason is that you want the person who votes to be somebody who's legitimately registered to vote, they had to legitimately register to vote in order to become a registered voter in the first place. So there's no need to make them have to keep repeating that over and over and over again. This is just annoying people, knowing that some people will just not go through that process and won't end up voting at all. And that's their goal. Their goal is not to knock everybody out, but if I can knock 10% of this group out and 15% of this group out and 8% of this other group out, I can end up with the larger numbers in the group that actually participated in voting. This is just a way that people are using the tools of power to marginalize people even more than they already have been.
Absolutely. It is definitely a voter suppression tactic, and it is nothing that is supported by data or
Yep.
anything that shows that fraud is somehow kind of running rampant in voting in elections. So having these extra added requirements, there's no real data that shows that it's necessary or that it needs to be preventing fraud.
And the worst harm is keeping those people from voting. That's the worst harm.
That's
If
the
you had
worst harm.
one person out of 18,000 that didn't have a right to cast that vote, as opposed to having 2,000 of that 18,000 not showing up to vote at all because you're making it too difficult for them to vote, which is the worst harm. I think that's how we have to look at this thing.
Ms. Wilson, anything final words?
I would just say that we've come a long way, particularly in New York State, but there's still a lot more work to be done. And as Reverend Blue said, there was this great executive order that said that individuals who are on parole can now register to vote, but that only goes so far. It's basically a partial pardon. the people still have to take the initiative to get registered, to figure out how they can register. They have to have a certificate. It's not enough. And there's legislation pending. I heard a rumor it's actually going to be on the floor of the Senate tomorrow to codify that so that they will automatically be registered as soon as they are released. We want to make sure that all justice involved individuals have full enfranchisement. There's also a New York State Voting Rights Act that's pending. There's so much more that still needs to be done, and it's a very exciting time. So if you're interested in getting involved in that sort of policy work, all of the organizations on this panel are doing that work, and we hope to hear from you, I think.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. Get involved. You know, so much of the information that we often get is from the media. And so we know that that's not necessarily the most accurate place. You have to make sure that you fact check everything that you hear. And so getting involved with these organizations will help you ensure that the information that you're receiving and the work that you're doing is something that is genuine and something that really is going to help our communities. And so I want to again thank you all representing these organizations, the NAACP, the League of Women Voters, and SANIS. Thank you so much for your participation, and bringing this information to all of us is just so important for our community and for our country, for our world, matter of fact.
Absolutely.
So thank you all for the work that you put in for this presentation and for participating today. And we want to thank all of you for attending tonight. We couldn't have done it without you all here. So we thank you for attending and spending time with us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Did a great job. Great job, Judge. Appreciate everything
Thank you.
that you've done.
All right.
Thank you, Judge.
Thank you. Everyone have a wonderful night.
All right. Be well. Thanks, Liz. All right. Jennifer, good to see you. BJ, good to see you. All right.
Good to see you.
Bye.
Take
Bye.
care.